Hey, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our press conference for Make Care Count, which is Aware's latest research report about eldercare. I'm Kelly Liao, the communications manager at Aware. So Aware's research team is Shelley Hingorani, Chong Ling Tian, and Preeti Devi, who is somewhere around. So as you might know, Aware kind of chooses one kind of pressing gender-related issue to research every year, and this year we decided to research eldercare in Singapore. Singapore's aging population is not a new conversation topic by any means, but by examining this issue from a gender perspective, our research has shone a spotlight on some really under-discussed aspects of aging and caregiving in Singapore, and these aspects have a really significant bearing on the lives of many women in Singapore, and so on behalf of those women, we really appreciate your coverage of these topics. So I'm going to kick things off with Shelley, who's going to present a summary of our research and recommendations on this issue. After Shelley, Dr. Rahul Malhotra of Duke NUS will give his remarks, and then Chris Fu, who is a caregiver and a self-employed design consultant, will share her experiences caregiving to her mother. So, Shelley.
Thank you. Hi everyone. It typically takes me an hour to do this presentation. I'm going to try and squeeze it in 30 minutes. So there may be instances where I'm speaking too fast or I'm saying things that are coming out as gibberish. If you have questions at that point, feel free to stop me, but I would prefer if you could keep questions to the end. We've also circulated a copy of our report in advance, so you should have additional information available in the report as well. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump right in. As Kelly mentioned, our campaign, as well as our research report, is called Make Care Count. This project started last year with a big, bold research question. And our question was, how does providing care to older persons affect the retirement adequacy of female primary family caregivers between the ages of 45 to 65? Now, there are a couple of terms here that I want to hone in on. Older persons was defined for the purposes of this study as people over the age of 65. Retirement adequacy, I'm going to explain what that means on the next slide. For female primary family caregivers, we said that primary family caregivers were people who self-identified as the primary family caregiver, and they had to be co-residing with their care recipient as well. We also wanted to eliminate the effects of childcare responsibility. So we said that we only want to look at caregivers who did not have any young children. So they could have children, but they had to be over the age of 21 in order to qualify as a respondent for this particular study. So what did we find? And spoilers alert, I thought that I'll start by really sharing with you what our year-long research found. First of all, retirement adequacy. We operationalized retirement adequacy as 4 parameters: employment, income, expenditure, and wealth. I'll give you a broad overview of what we found on each one of these parameters, but the rest of my presentation is going to be focused on employment and income. There are more details on wealth as well as expenditure in our report if you want more information on those. Okay, so what did we find on employment? We found that, as with everybody else, caregivers have a finite amount of time, and as their caregiving responsibilities increase, as they become primary caregivers, they have to either reduce the amount of work they do or completely withdraw from the labor force. And in fact, and I'll explain this a bit later, our group of respondents are actually split evenly into those who reduced the amount of time they were spending working and those who completely withdrew from the labor force. In terms of income, those who did experience a change because of caregiving, they experienced an average loss in income of 63%. 63%. And that's the financial cost of caregiving that we're talking about. In terms of the average annual loss in CPF contribution, I mean, some of you may ask why CPF contribution here when we're talking about income. Because if you were to think about income from the perspective of retirement adequacy, you would think about the contributions that employers make to your CPF you would also think about the self-contributions that you're making to your own CPF. So our respondents, those who experienced a change because of caregiving, experienced an average annual loss in CPF contribution of 7,000. This is annual. In terms of expenditure, we decided to bifurcate the expenditure. So we're only interested in care-related expenses. We bifurcated the expenditure category into recurring expenses, so care-related expenses that you have to bear on a monthly basis, on a regular basis, and one-off expenses. So an example of a recurring expense would be paying for your domestic worker, right? You have to pay them a salary every month. That's a recurring expense. So our respondents were paying 37% of their monthly household income on recurring expenses. And this is after subsidies, 37%. One-off expenses, they spent about 17,000 over the year. And an example of one-off expenses will be home modifications. That's not something that you do frequently, that's something that you do once in a while. And on wealth, even though wealth is an important parameter of retirement adequacy, we found that most of our respondents were actually fairly hesitant to talk about, the savings they had, how much money they had saved up. So one limitation of the study is that we don't have a lot of information from caregivers on their wealth status. But they did tell us that when it comes to family transfers among siblings tends to be undependable. So sometimes it comes in, sometimes it doesn't. And when it does come in, it's coming in specifically to reimburse the primary family caregiver for care-related expenses. So siblings, when they're making transfers, are not paying for the living expenses of the caregiver, even though they may have had to make employment-related sacrifices. So these are our findings. Outline. Okay, so this is just a plan of what I plan to do today. One is I want to give you more details on our respondents. What do they look like? What does their typical profile look like? Then, like I mentioned, I want to do a deep dive into two of our findings on employment as well as income. Third, I want to talk about mitigation strategies. So I want to talk about the kind of support that is available for caregivers from the state and employers. And finally, I will walk you through the recommendations that we are making, which we believe will enhance the retirement adequacy of family caregivers. Okay, so how many people did we interview? This is a qualitative piece of research. So we interviewed 22 respondents, 22 female primary family caregivers who were caring for 27 care recipients. And there's a difference between 22 and 27 because some caregivers were obviously caring for more than one care recipient, but they were the primary caregiver of only one. We also, after we collected all the data from our interviews with respondents, validated our findings, validated our analysis with stakeholders, for example, academics, for example, medical social workers. We also spoke to eldercare service providers, and we spoke to about 22 of them. We also wanted to present our research back to the caregivers to make sure that we had adequately captured their experiences. So we organized a focus group discussion that had 9 respondents, and we presented our major findings and recommendations back to them as well. Okay, now what does a typical respondent of this study look like? You don't see any specific percentage data here because it's a qualitative study, but this is a typical profile. Because the study was focused mainly on, actually completely on female family caregivers, so all our respondents are women. They are between the ages of 56 and 65. They were typically caring for a parent, so that was the relationship they had with their care recipient. The parent was on average aged 80. Most of our caregivers, most of our caregivers and respondents had siblings. In fact, only one of them was an only child. And despite having siblings, it was the respondent who ended up taking on primary caregiving responsibilities. So the care arrangement ended up being such that the unmarried daughter with no kids became the primary caregiver. And this is quite significant, and I can talk more about this later during the Q&A if you're interested. Our caregivers were caring for people who required help with an average 2.11 ADLs, activities of daily living. 50% of the care recipients had dementia. Aging in place, I mean, you all have heard about aging in place, right? Which is this concept that as you grow older, you should be able to age comfortably as well as independently in your own home. And as part of this research, we were interested in whether it was the care recipient's decision or the caregiver's decision to age in place. And we found that 7 care recipients were obviously, they were interested in aging in place. But surprisingly, 11 caregivers thought that it would be the best execution of their family obligations, of their sense of familial piety, if they were caring for their parents at home. And then finally, the monthly household income was $3,005. Okay, so finding number 1, changes in employment status. What did we really find? We found that 14 out of 21 respondents. So remember, we started with 22 respondents. One of them was not working, even before they became a primary caregiver, which is why this number is 21. So 14 out of 21 respondents experienced a change in their employment status and income, and they cited caregiving as the primary reason. I mentioned earlier that caregivers make different kinds of compromises, different kinds of work accommodations. One is reduction, so you may go from being full-time before being a primary caregiver, a full-time primary caregiver, to a part-time worker, or you may be working in a part-time job and you have to completely withdraw, you have to completely stop working, right? So the 14 were evenly split into people who decided to reduce as well as completely withdraw from the labor force. We also found, even though we did not want to press our respondents on the amount of time they spent providing care, right? Because it's often really difficult to estimate how much time you're spending, and we did not want to put the caregivers on the spot. So what we did was we used ADLs as well as dementia as proxies for the intensity of caregiving. And we found that if you were caring for someone who required help with more than 3 ADLs and or dementia, you were likely to have had to make some work-related accommodation. Dementia was another complicating factor. And in fact, if you were caring for someone with dementia, you're much more likely to not be working, much more likely to be outside the labor force and actively not looking for work. Now, changes in employment status obviously have short-term consequences, right? You have made some sort of arrangement with your workplace, you're now doing part-time, you may be on a flexible work arrangement, but there are also long-term consequences to changes in employment status. Some of these have to do with skills. Your skills become rusty, right? Because you've been out of the workforce for a long time. You may also experience a wage penalty because you were last in the workforce 5 years ago and things have sort of moved on and you have lost out on work experience for 5 years. You may also experience ageism because when you stepped out of the workforce, maybe you were 45 or 50, and by the time you come back, you are a decade older. So things have changed. And you also have your own health to worry about. I mean, you're growing old as well as you're caring for your parent. So there are long-term consequences as well. Finding B is loss in income, obviously. I mentioned 63% average loss. This translated to $56,000 every year. This is the loss in self and employer CPF contribution. Like I mentioned, it's $7,000 a year. I had to put these slides back in just as a quick reminder because now I'm going to go into the mitigation strategies that are available for caregivers, both who remain in the labor force and those who are not in the labor force anymore. So what do I mean by mitigation? I mean, we all know that caregiving is hard, right? It has physical consequences on the caregiver's health, it has emotional consequences, and it also has financial consequences, because now you're experiencing a loss in income, you may be socially isolated. All that together is called the caregiver burden, right? It's the strain, the load that you carry when you're providing care to an older person. On the left-hand side, what you see are issues that caregivers themselves raised. And these issues specifically speak to what would enable them to balance work and caregiving responsibilities better. So they ask for flexibility. Flexibility is important to them because sometimes they have to take their care recipients to the hospital. And this may come up suddenly. You may have a meeting to attend at work that you're no longer available for because you have to take your mother to the hospital. You may also have situations when, if you're caring for someone with dementia, they're having a bad day and your domestic worker is not being able to handle them, right? So you have to stay back at home. They also asked for a supportive work culture because they actually found that even when they had flexible work arrangements available, they were often negatively judged for being flexible, for having a disrupted work schedule. And finally, they obviously wanted protection from discrimination because even though they were working caregivers, they were not like the other workers, right? Because they had a big chunk of their day devoted to caregiving. On the right-hand side are the supports that are available. This is the way the government supports working caregivers. So on flexibility, they provide a tripartite advisory on flexible work arrangements. So as an employer, if you want the badge of being a progressive employer, you can sign up for this. They also encourage employers to provide unpaid caregiving leave. For supportive work culture, we know that there has been some amount of resistance to the adoption of flexible work arrangements. So the government provides financial incentives to employers, right? So that they can introduce flexible work arrangements in the workplace. And finally, there are two protections available, one under the Employment Act and the other under the Retirement and Re-employment Act. But in the next slide, I will talk about why these levels of support and these forms of support are not enough. So on the left-hand side, you have what I have just walked you through, which is what the government provides in terms of providing support to working caregivers. And on the right-hand side is our little column to talk about what more still needs to be done. So on flexible work arrangements, this idea of flexibility, we know that availability, the mere availability of flexible work arrangements does not automatically translate to utilization of flexible work arrangements. You may very well be working for someone who provides flexible work arrangements, but that does not mean that you don't face any other organizational barriers to access and use these flexible work arrangements. And if you were to look at national level data, you do see that take-up remains low. And it does remain low because there are fears that you will not be evaluated as other workers are. Other workers who are not on flexible work arrangements, because face time with your bosses is really important, right? And productivity is often measured as the number of hours you spend at work. Unpaid caregiving leave is good, but not all caregivers can take the financial hit, right? So if you're not going to get paid for the days you're caring for your parents, you're taking a financial hit, right? So before they utilize unpaid caregiving leave, caregivers often use their own annual leave, which may seem like a good solution, but if they fall sick, if they have to recuperate, they don't have their own annual leave available, right? So that has consequences for their own health. It has consequences for their psychological, emotional well-being. Financial incentives to employers are obviously good because there is some resistance. And one way to push past the resistance is to provide financial incentives. But what we need is a change in work culture, right? Where we are not using productivity as the number of hours an employee spends at work. We need managers to role model the use of flexible work arrangements. We need companies to really invest in not only providing support to working caregivers, but being seen as providing support. So it has to become public within the organization. The protections available against discrimination are typically restricted to wrongful dismissals. So if you have been dismissed because of a certain type of discrimination, that's protected. But what is not protected is if you're being discriminated against on grounds of age, family responsibilities, in the hiring process, when it comes to promotion, when it comes to how you're going to be evaluated for your family responsibilities. So that's what we think a big gap is. So what are we recommending? And I have a series of recommendations here. More details are in the report. I'm just going to walk you through the big picture recommendations. One is that because we know that caregivers want flexibility, and there is an organizational culture that exists that prevents them from utilizing flexible work arrangements even when they're available, we're saying one way to deal with this issue is to actually introduce a statutory right to flexible work arrangements, which means that every single employee will have the right to ask for flexible work arrangements. So you're no longer isolating specific groups of employees, mothers, caregivers of the elderly. You're saying everybody has this right available. And if you were to introduce this statutory right, one way to design this policy would be to say that employers actually have to give you a business-related reason for turning down a request for flexible work arrangements. This is the case in several Commonwealth countries like Australia, New Zealand, as well as UK, and I can talk about the specific policy design around this later if you like. Another recommendation that we have, so remember, the government encourages employers to offer unpaid caregiving leave. We're saying actually, if mothers get 6 days of paid childcare leave, then why not working caregivers get leave, paid leave, for caring for their elderly? So we're asking the government to legislate 6 days of paid eldercare leave. Now, another mitigation. So we talked about strategies that were available to working caregivers from the work side, right? So we said make paid eldercare leave available, make it possible for people to take flexible work arrangements. Another form of support is available in the form of domestic workers and community and home-based services, right? So as a caregiver, if you think your load is unbearable, you could redistribute your caregiving responsibilities by hiring a domestic worker or utilizing any of the many home-based or community-based services, right? And the government provides subsidies for both these. What the triangle is meant to represent is the three parties that enable aging in place. You know, the idea that you can age comfortably and independently in your house. But what we noticed, and what the caregivers that we spoke to brought up, was that actually there's a lack of sustained usage of home and community-based services. So 13 out of 22 of our respondents did not make use of formal care services, long-term services, on a sustained basis. 50% of them relied on domestic workers, but even when they were able to redistribute some of their caregiving responsibilities to domestic workers, they were not sufficient as a care option, and I'll explain why. And ultimately, caregivers required additional support because even though they had availability of formal care services that they could access, they could hire domestic workers, it was still not enough. They required additional support. So, formal care services. Why are caregivers not routinely using home-based and community-based services? One is that there are concerns around the perception of quality of care. So one of the respondents that we spoke to had a particularly bad experience with a private nurse that she had hired. That has her swearing off using home care services in the future. In our focus group discussion, when we spoke to 9 caregivers, many of them also mentioned that when they took their care recipients to the daycare center, and these were daycare centers that were devoted to providing care for dementia patients, they found the general environment of these daycare centers to be fairly unappealing, and that these home care services were not providing stimulating activities, mentally stimulating activities for their care recipients. I mean, one of them I distinctly remember said that she would take her care recipient to a daycare center. She would see that her care recipient was seated in front of a TV almost as soon as they arrived. And when they picked this care recipient up in the evening, the care recipient was still sitting in front of the television. And that made her wonder if the care recipient had actually spent the entire day just watching TV, which is something that you can easily arrange for at home. Why would you send your care recipient to a day center for that, right? Our respondents also spoke about information gaps. So there's a lot of information available, but they felt that sometimes it wasn't organized in a way that was friendly to the user. So they didn't know what services were available. They didn't know how to go about accessing those services. They didn't know how to analyze different services, right? Because which one is good, which one will work best for my particular care recipient, it was difficult to say based on the information available online. And of course, there was some general sort of reluctance on the part of care recipients as well, right? They wanted to age in place, and now suddenly you're taking them to a daycare center. So they were like, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? And then, of course, we had caregivers who also thought that it was best to care for their parents at home. They wanted to provide physical caregiving. They wanted to be around. Okay, domestic workers. Now, domestic workers are also not sufficient as a mitigation strategy because many of them do not receive specialized training. So if they're caring for someone who has dementia, and exhibits a lot of behavioral problems, it's often difficult for the domestic worker to know how to manage this person because they have not been specially trained. Now, there are also caregiving related tasks that domestic workers are not able to perform. For example, emotional care that really depends sometimes on the family connection that you have with your care recipient. And finally, a big part of what it means to be a primary family caregiver means that you're providing financial management of care costs, which is another aspect of caregiving that domestic workers are not able to help with, right? So domestic workers are not completely sufficient. And as a result, caregivers end up requiring additional support. So they require additional support because they often don't have access to navigation and coordination support. There are lots of services available. There are lots of subsidies available. How do I make sense of all this information? How do I do a cost-benefit analysis, both from the perspective of the particular sort of health condition that my care recipient has and the financial state of my house? And they felt that there was a general lack of guidance in long-term planning. Now, this was especially acute for those who had not come in touch with the hospital system. So if you're hospitalized, you're often put in touch with a medical social worker who will provide coordination and navigation support to you, to the family member. But if your care recipient has not been hospitalized, you actually don't have access to this kind of support, which means that you're spending much more time on doing navigation and coordination than you need to. So if somebody just provided you with that service, that would actually free up some of your time. So what are we recommending? The big recommendation that we're making on home-based and community-based services is that one easy way to increase the utilization of these services is to regulate and license private providers. Do spot checks, do assessments, so that you actually boost user confidence, which will hopefully lead to an increase in the utilization of formal care services. We also think that care coordination and navigation should be made more widely available. The government has infrastructure in the form of cluster support services that for now is only available to those who are living by themselves and have little or no family support. We think this should be made available to all caregivers, to all care recipients, regardless of the kind of family support they have available. And finally, for this particular section, we're also saying that you should strengthen the financial security of caregivers. So they are experiencing a loss in income, they are experiencing a loss in CPF contributions. They're also finding it difficult to take advantage of all the mitigation strategies that the government has in place. All this together is going to have an impact on the retirement adequacy of caregivers. So we're saying that you must help these caregivers achieve retirement adequacy. And one possible way to do that is by introducing a caregiver support grant. And we think this should have two components, cash and CPF. Cash, we think that you can use salaries of paid care workers as a reference point. For CPF, we think that you could match it to prevailing employment contribution rates. And of course, we think this should be subject to conditions, but the condition cannot be that you have a domestic worker, so you are not going to get the caregiver support grant, because as we have just seen, domestic workers are not entirely sufficient when it comes to redistributing caregiving responsibilities. So in summary, these are our recommendations, and I only took an additional 5 minutes, which I'm really happy about. I'm going to leave this on the screen so that you can ask us questions about recommendations later. But that's it for now for me.
So thanks for the presentation. And so I'm Rahul Malhotra from Duke NUS Medical School. I'm the head of research at the Center for Aging Research and Education. So maybe a small disclaimer before I speak, I guess. So I haven't been directly involved in the research study, so I don't really endorse the findings in a sense. I can't kind of, and also, I mean, as a Duke NUS or the center and me personally, we don't endorse the recommendations. I think these are recommendations that are coming from AWARE. I'm here in my capacity as kind of an expert on research on caregiving in Singapore to give my thoughts and an opinion on the report overall. So that's the capacity in which I'm speaking. So I think maybe I'll divide my kind of comments into three. One would be, I guess, the strengths of the report. Two would be some limitations which can be bettered in future research. And third, I guess, a general comment on the policy situation in Singapore in terms of caregiving for older people in Singapore. So the report is definitely informative. It's been hard work. It definitely fills in a gap in research. We did a review of all the published literature on caregivers of older people in Singapore. It's available on the Duke NUS Care website. And we realized that there hasn't been much work in terms of the financial aspects, financial burden, financial implications of care provision to an older family member. So this report definitely, I think, is a good initiation towards filling that gap in terms of costs. And of course, if you don't have evidence, you can't talk to policymakers, you can't inform evidence-based policymaking. So definitely it's a step in the right direction. The second thing would be it's relatively comprehensive. So it covers not only direct care expenses that are undertaken by the family caregivers, but also talks about the income that they have lost, the CPF contributions that they have lost as a result of not being in the labor market, and the difficulties that they face when they are trying to come back to the labor market, or they at least foresee that they would face whenever they come back to the labor market. So it kind of speaks to the whole work and caregiving nexus, which will I think become more and more important as we move on, because I think employment rates in Singapore are increasing, are increasing both among men and women, and the number of children that the current cohorts of elderly have and the future cohorts are decreasing. So it's likely that the children who will become future caregivers will be working. So this whole nexus of work and caregiving, and how to make caregiving more work friendly, how to make work more caregiving friendly, has to be thought about very carefully. The third thing is it validates some of the findings that we've done in bigger surveys. For example, in the science study, whose report again is available on our website, we published this year, the most common reason for older women who reported they had retired early was family caregiving responsibilities, and you do find the same situation. So it's good if the same thing is kind of reported in bigger surveys and smaller surveys and quantitative and qualitative findings. It's a triangulation of the finding, and therefore it speaks to a situation that really exists in Singapore. In terms of, I guess, some I guess not limitations, but things that could be improved in future work, I would say. I mean, one would be, I think it's a small select sample of women, right? So it's women who are never married, who most of the majority of them have no children, and therefore their family situation in terms of the household income, in terms of other things, may be different from somebody who is married and who has children, who maybe in that by that age the children would be earning and contributing to the household income as well. So depending on, I mean, if the scope of the study is expanded in future, there may be the numbers or the proportions may change, but still caregiving is financially draining. That one cannot kind of argue against. The second thing would be these are kind of initial numbers, and again from a qualitative study, so the numbers are definitely there. They need to be validated in bigger studies in future, and also kind of would be good to have also to have a bigger study. Maybe it intersects with other aspects of caregiving. So there is the health aspect, the caregiver burden. There's also the positive aspects of caregiving. The fact that you're caring for somebody who's cared for you throughout your life can be fulfilling and positive in nature as well. And therefore, maybe a study that brings all these factors together would be interesting, and maybe putting a plug in for the work that I'm doing at Duke NUS. I have funding from NMRC for doing a big study of caregivers in Singapore of older individuals, in which we plan to enroll and follow around 500 to 600 pairs of older persons and the caregivers over time, and collecting a lot of data. So hopefully our study maybe by next year would provide some of this more intersection of the various aspects of caregiving. In terms of policy, I think the speed at which Singapore is aging and the speed at which caregiving and family caregiving is becoming increasingly important has the policy steps and the policy discussions and the policy implementations have to match up with the speed at which Singapore is aging. I mean, why I say that is, I think if you look at the policy landscape in terms of support for older people and support for caregivers, I think it has definitely, the speed has increased over the past 10 years or so. Compared to 2000, in the early 2000s compared to now, I think there is more out there in terms of supporting older people, which indirectly supports the caregivers, but also there is more support for caregivers as well. The Caregiver Support Action Plan that was announced recently, and changes, but these I think could be, I guess, expedited. There could be more done more in a faster way, so as to support the caregivers when they really need it. So that would be one. So again, I think there is policy initiative from the government in terms of putting the caregivers in the front of their agenda as well, but more could be done for sure. And some of the recommendations out there should be kind of discussed and thought through by the policymakers, and of course, to what extent they can be implemented and at what speed they could be implemented. Can they be ramped up slowly and so on, is something for the policymakers to discuss. So those would be my comments.
Thank you.
Okay, and now we're going to have Chris, who's going to share her personal experience as a caregiver. I'm just going to sit here. And then I should also note that, Rahul, you have to leave at around 11:30.
You have to leave at 11:30, so I apologize for that.
So after Chris shares her story, we're going to just have Rahul's questions first, so that you can just get out of here early.
Morning, everyone. My name is Chris. I think of myself first and foremost as a design consultant. I'm self-employed. That was a major part of my life. My career formed my identity. And I then started to formally take care of my mother, who is 86 years old. She has dementia. In 2012. 2012 was the year when we first had our hiring of maids. And since then, in 7 years, we've had 6 maids. That has been very, very challenging. I came into caregiving voluntarily. I really wanted to understand my mother's conditions. I wanted to provide the best care for her, aging in place for sure at home, because that is the environment that she was most familiar with. Hiring the domestic helpers at first was to help her with household chores. in 2012, when I started caregiving for her, I noticed a diminished quality in her memory. This is because I've lived with her most of my life. We do a lot of activities together. We have meals together. We watch Cantonese soap TV, operas together. And then I realized that more and more I had to repeat to her the stories that had been played out on TV. I had to repeat to her the activities that I would be engaged in when I would be leaving the house. And honestly, because in my personal context with my mother, my relationship with her, there's a lot of emotional closeness and dependence actually. So even in the years that I was running my business, I started in 2002 when I had a rented office in Tanjong Pagar. There were many times when she would call me and ask me for help, ask me what time was I coming home, why was I working till 2 a.m. in the morning. So there was a constant conflict within me. The need to attend to my mother as well as to my own business. Now, 2014 was when she was confirmed with vascular dementia. Vascular dementia means it must have arisen from a series of very minor strokes. So minor that you probably wouldn't notice in the care recipient. And then by a psychological assessment, as well as one that required her to draw a clock. As simple as that confirmed that she had dementia. Prior to that, for 2 years, it was called, I think, mild cognitive dissonance. I think in other words, it's borderline dementia. Now, aside from dementia that was now creeping up on my mom, she also suffers from hyperthyroidism, which I found out later that that gives rise to symptoms like anxiety. And she also suffered from mild depression. Combination of all these factors made my journey extremely challenging. And so in 2014, I thought that I would, move my office back home to my mom's place, basically, and operate from there. By that time, I had already established a reputation, I thought, confidence in carrying out work from a home environment. And I thought that would be the best way to, one, cut down on my overheads, two, have a lot more quality time with mom. Didn't know what I was getting into, financially speaking as well. Although I run a business, and although I am very, very conscious of my financial management, both my business as well as personal, I really did not expect the impact it's taken on me, financially speaking. In 4 years, from 2012 to 2016, I spent about $100,000 just on my mom's household expenses. Because I think, well, my situation also arises, give you a little bit of background. It comes from the fact that I'm single, I'm the unmarried daughter, so it is expected that I take on this role. On top of that, I've lived with mom all my life. I know mom, my sibling, my only one other sibling who is an older sister, she's not lived with us for 30 years. She's had her own life, her own career, her own family. And I think by that expectation from my family, both mom and my sister, it's a natural extension of my care, I thought, to stay home and look after mom, give the best support. I did not expect all the challenges that came with it. The stress with managing foreign domestic workers who are not trained in dementia. To my mother, the trust that she's had with me has been built over the years as mother and daughter. It cannot be replaced with a trust of a stranger in the house. Any person who is outside of the family is considered a stranger in the house by my mother. And my mother had extremely high expectations of housework, housekeeping standards. She was so used to her own ways because until she had dementia, she was mobile and independent, and she cleaned the house. It was like a museum, you know. Then I came on board. I came back and I took on the role, hiring, recruiting helpers, finding that there were a lot of personal management issues with them, with my mother as well, because with dementia comes other symptoms, temperaments, temper tantrums, inability to stable herself while walking. So physically and mentally, there's a lot that she needed help with. Then, of course, there were other issues of the quality of care by the domestic workers. Were they hired just to clean the house, cook, do the necessary arrangements? But they were also encouraged and required to engage with my mother, and that's very difficult. It's extremely difficult. With dementia also comes problems like sundowning times. This I found out. This means just before bedtime, care recipients who have dementia generally suffer from this sundowning time. Their moods change. Some I've heard want to walk around, wander around, even leave the house. My mother, for example, her mood would change to a very unpleasant one, and then she would start to bicker with the helper and myself. And I tried all kinds of ways to coax her, to persuade her, to soothe her, to comfort her, losing my cool, many occasions, crying. A lot of that doesn't help, because I think in a care recipient venting their frustration, it is their sense of still trying to retain some control over their environment, some sort of dignity over their own personal space. And that is very hard to teach or explain to a foreign domestic worker. It's even hard for own family members to continue and carry on that kind of a burden for long term. So now, financially speaking, I got broke. My income was impacted so much, I lost my sense of focus. I lost my network of clients. Things changed in the marketplace. I don't think my skills are obsolete, but perhaps I would feel out of the marketplace. I even feel like a tourist in Orchard Road, because I go down, once in a while there, and I find like there are new buildings, and I have to navigate my way around, because in 4 years I had become so homebound. I lost a lot of social contacts in the sense of outings with my friends, having meals with them. So then I thought 2 years ago, I really need to have somebody in my life to support me, I felt. How do you go about dating at 50 years old? Also, the cultural expectations, the family expectations at home. I've always been single. I've never had a serious relationship. But now I realize in taking care of my mother that when I'm her age, nobody's going to take care of me. On top of that, and in a very big way, I had a fallout with my sibling. There's a lot of strain and tension because of the unequal distribution of caregiver responsibility between the two of us. Again, it was an expectation for me to take on more of the burden. But when you feel so isolated in managing the household and learning along the way how to deal with your mother's conditions and your slowly depleting savings, there's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of resentment also in that, because when you do not receive enough emotional and financial support, it takes a toll on you. And I had a caregiver burnout in 2015, 3 years into caregiving for my mom. All of it came together. It was a mental toll. I did not have caregiver breaks. I did not have an alternative place to stay and have my own respite. I did not understand what was self-care. And now self-care in this aspect of financial retirement adequacy is also something that I'm starting to think about. Because I think when you're single and you are in your mid-30s, it doesn't worry you because you're in the middle of your career, you're in the middle of, doing things that are pleasurable to you. When you have extremely heavy duties or responsibilities of attending to a care recipient at home, your own mother, and you find that you're aging, you're not exercising that much, you have little understanding of the conditions and also little national awareness of this big issue of aging, you really feel burnt out, you feel worn out, and you feel worried. I feel very insecure about my future. I've depleted my savings. I have no spousal support. My income is practically gone. I have no other family monetary support. I'm now using my mother's own savings for her own expenses. I have no property of my own. I live with my mother in her flat. I have little CPF because when I started my own business, I chose to not contribute to CPF because I was worried about cash flow. So with all these weighing heavily on me, and I'm 52, I just turned 52 last year, how can I sustain my own level of comfort in the future? How can I look after myself? Who will look after me? And so this is very uncertain for me. This is my take on caregiving. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Welcome.
I will have time to ask Chris questions. At this point, I just wanted to invite any questions for Rahul before he has to leave.
Yeah.
Can I talk about the main limitation that this research
I guess, the limitations, I guess, are, I wouldn't call them limitations, as I said before. I think it's more in relation to kind of how the findings, I think what needs to be done is also kind of maybe do similar work in other groups of caregivers who have a slightly different profile. So as Shelley had pointed out, I think these most really, not all, but most of the women in this group don't have a spouse or a companion, and they don't have children, right? So I'm not saying that their problems are not important. I think this definitely raises their voice and brings to fore their issues, which should be strongly looked into. But it would be interesting to also see whether similar issues or certain other issues crop up among other groups of caregivers, say male caregivers who are caring about with their parents or for a spouse. Do they have different needs compared to female caregivers? Is it the same among caregivers who have maybe a stronger family structure around them in terms of a spouse and children who may be contributing financially, who may be contributing in terms of providing actual direct care to the older persons? So I think it's not a limitation of this study. I think this study does it well in terms of the focus that they have, which is women of a certain age group, and I guess I don't know whether it's by design or it's just happened that most of the women who were enrolled in the study ended up being of a certain profile. But it would be interesting to not by design. So I mean, it's just I guess you had some sort of a sampling, and so I think it would be interesting to see if the findings are mirrored in other subgroups of caregivers of older people, and if not, what else is different there. And are there certain specific issues that might surface if you repeat the study in other samples?
Can I also share a bit about the significance of this kind of research in shaping policies related to caregiving?
Sure. So I think this kind of research is important because I think it's where you can hear the voice of the caregiver. I think work. I would broadly classify kind of research studies into two, if you may. One would be more quantitative surveys in which you have bigger samples, you administer scales and questions, and you get some score on, say, a depression scale or a caregiver burden scale. Those are informative in terms of telling us the distribution of caregiver burden among caregivers, what subgroups are more or less burdened, and so on. But I think what qualitative research like this adds on to is why. Why are certain groups more burdened compared to other groups? Why are they facing specific issues? So I think I think if one kind of puts a number, this kind of adds a human element and a voice to the number. So both kind of complement each other. And therefore, for policy making, I think both are important. You not only want to know who is more burdened, but you also want to know why are they burdened at the same time, so as to arrive at kind of good policy decisions.
I'm Monica from RMIT News.
Mhm.
Is there research in Singapore to show that the burden of caregiving still falls on women in general? And if this is the case, then with such a rapidly increasing aging society, if it remains status quo,
Mhm.
will the burden on female caregivers be? I mean, will they have to
Right.
bear the brunt of it in future?
Right. So, I mean, I don't have the numbers with me. I can't give you a proportion, but at least the work that we did way back in 2011, which was a national survey, did show that most of the caregivers of older people aged 75 and above were women. And a large proportion were daughters and daughter-in-laws and wives. I think, and based on my reading of other research that has come out since, I think it still remains a gender-biased story in terms of caregiving. Women are maybe, and I think it's largely because of the whole traditional reasons in Singapore and in Asian societies. I think caring for the family, both in terms of younger children as well as older family members, has been traditionally been thought to be a woman's job. So it has changed, I would say, over the years. So I don't have the latest numbers, but as I said, we are doing a bigger quantitative survey that is a national sample of caregivers. And hopefully by the time, by early next year, we would have more updated numbers on what does the gender profile of caregivers in Singapore. But initial findings from there again suggest women seem to be predominant in terms of caring for their older parents.
How will this impact the society in general?
I mean,
Continues?
yeah, I mean, increasingly, I think I think the current cohort of older Singaporeans has, if you may, the luxury of having had more children. Whereas in the future cohorts, we will definitely, I mean, the fertility rates have been relatively low over the past 2 or 3 decades, and they don't seem to kind of go up dramatically. I mean, there doesn't seem to be much going on, and on that front, the fertility rates are relatively stagnant, below replacement fertility level. So more and more older people will either have only one child, and I guess you have to remember the child is one, but the parents are two. So they have to kind of have two parents to look after. But also there would be a big chunk of older people who wouldn't have children. And as our kind of Ms. Chris kind of pointed out here, what happens and who cares for her when she, I mean, God forbid, but all of us are aging, and with age, health issues crop up. When she requires caregiving in the future, what about individuals who don't have children? And therefore, I mean, for them, I think it's more than the home and community-based care that would come into picture, and maybe institutional care. But again, as Shelley said, there needs to be more improvement in that side in terms of the quality of the care being provided and regulations and so on.
Senator from Yahoo in Singapore, is there a reason why there's a focus on caregivers their age 45, 65? Because I understand from speaking to caregivers in the community that it's sort of getting younger in Singapore.
Right. So maybe Shelley could answer that. I think that's better.
Why don't I respond to that question after Rahul leaves? We're just taking questions for Rahul. That's a question for our research study. So I'll respond to
So I'm kind of commenting more as like an outside expert on the study findings. I wasn't intimately involved in the research itself.
How about, in your opinion, is there like a big increase in young
I would say, I mean, if you talk about primary caregivers who are designated maybe by the family as the person who is the centerpiece of caregiving for an older person, I would still say it's in that age range of say 40 to 60. When you look at older parents, if you look at spousal caregivers, of course, then a lot of the caregivers would be older. But we do see involvement of younger family members. There may be kind of, I don't have exact number again. I mean, there are instances, of course, where younger, say, caregivers in their 20s could be caring for their grandparents, maybe unfortunately because the parents are not around or so on. But those instances are not that common compared to sons and daughters looking after their parents. But that definitely exists. But I don't really see a huge jump in that number as of now.
So as a review paper, just wondering, I mean, we've all seen the recommendations, right? You personally, with your experience, is there anything you would suggest differently, anything you would add, any of them you would tweak?
Right. So I think what would be important, I think in my mind would be flexible work arrangements and more support at the workplace. So not only kind of having flexible work arrangements, but making sure that the employees are not hesitant in seeking them and asking for them, and the employers are supportive of employees who seek them. Of course, there would be industries and situations where it cannot happen, right? If you are in a customer-facing industry with a fixed time, if you are in a hospital, for example, there may be certain roles where you would not be able to have flexible work arrangements. But to the extent it's possible, I think that to me is key, because I think in our work as well, we've seen many women leaving the workforce because of caregiving responsibilities, be it child caregiving maybe or elder caregiving. We didn't do the distinction in our study, but it could be both. And so the flexible work arrangement and leaves that support caregivers when they are either paid care leave or unpaid care leave with some sort of maybe a guarantee that they can come back to the job that they had without being penalized for us, it would be useful. So I think there needs to be more done at the work caregiving nexus.
Amanda from Carnegie as well. You spoke about the speed of providing support and how it has increased over the last 20 years. Yet we can see from the study it's clearly not quick enough.
Right.
What do you think? What more do you think can be done to increase the urgency with policymakers in putting eldercare and caregiving at the forefront?
Right. I think I mean, would be more research like this. I mean, more research like this that is funded, and I think there is policy interest in funding research like this as well. I mean, maybe just hopping back on the study that I have, it was funded by the National Medical Research Council. That speaks to the fact that there is policy interest in supporting research on caregiving. They definitely, policymakers are looking out for evidence and data that can help them in driving policies. So that would be one. So more research on topics that are of relevance. I think I think you will find things improving. I think the overall ramping up of the home care services and of the daycare services and nursing homes has increased over the past, especially over the past 5-6 years. I think there are much more places coming up. So maybe if they repeat the study in a few years, maybe there would be few changes. But I think it's in addition to the physical infrastructure being put in there, I think what's important is the quality of the care that's being provided. So I think if more can be done in terms of putting an approval stamp on the quality of care in terms of some sort of a rating scheme, I mean, you have the hawker centers out there, right? When you go, you look at the A, B, and the C, and I guess you don't really eat at the D stall. And then, so maybe some sort of a framework. I'm not saying you put it on every caregiver, but in a sense, there should be more, maybe a framework which can give more confidence to a layperson going in and saying, okay, this is what I should expect, and this is what I will get back if I enroll my mother or father or spouse in this facility. I think more could be done on that front.
Better communication.
Yeah, meta communication of the quality of care, I would say, and cost as well. I think the cost also has to be kept in mind. So both the things.
Hi, Ray from the Straits Times. I'm just wondering if you think that there's any areas of policy where there's some friction or resistance from the establishment, and why there is that resistance, and whether more research can really help to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very tough question for me to answer, honestly. So because honestly, I think our role is kind of more providing the evidence to the policymakers, and then, I mean, overall, I mean, I can't really kind of pinpoint an area, I would say. But I think, I mean, just looking at it from a broader perspective, not having any personal conversation, so I'm not kind of quoting anybody that I've talked to. I think a big consideration, I think, is the cost. I think you can have a lot of services. You could have a personalized care kind of coordinator for each caregiver, care recipient diet in Singapore, but everything is going to cost money. So I think a big consideration for providing a lot of these and meeting a lot of these recommendations could likely be who will foot the bill for this. Because I think a lot of recommendations have been implemented, have been done in European countries, Scandinavian countries, other countries, where I guess there are sources of income in terms of taxations which can help support a lot of these facilities. So unless until there are kind of other financial mechanisms by which it can be supported, I think cost will remain a big kind of consideration and implementation. I mean, cost from the perspective of not only government but also perspective of the employers for having kind of more flexible work arrangements. So I think cost always comes into play in terms of development of facilities as well as utilization of care facilities.
Okay, I think at this point, Rahul.
Yes, I have to leave.
With that,
I'll
any
lose
other
my job.
questions? You can always email.
One question for Ashleigh. So one of the recommendations that we didn't spend much time talking about that was in the report was on reducing or rather changing the requirements for the cashier life, reduce it from the 3 ADR requirement. So I understand that during the debate on when the bill was passed, they actually brought this some MPs brought this up, and it was actually put down because of the cost issue. So I was just wondering, for some of the recommendations, do you think that there are any limitations in terms of like what Dr. Rahul mentioned in terms of cost, and how feasible and how realistic are the recommendations?
Right. I mean, so our general approach to making recommendations to the government is that we base them on experiments and policies that have been tried out in other countries. So we know that these recommendations are practical, they are feasible, they have been tried out in countries where there is support and recognition available for caregivers. On the specific recommendation that you mentioned, one of the findings that I did not get a chance to spend much time on was the amount of money that caregivers are spending when caring for someone with dementia but less than 3 ADLs. And that is a significant cost. And what we're asking for when making that recommendation on CareShield is that the government essentially takes a holistic approach to assessing the care needs of care recipients in Singapore. That it should not be, the CareShield payout should not be tied to just ADL requirements. It should not be tied to even just dementia. I mean, we should be talking about instrumental activities of daily living. We should be talking about other mental conditions that may have an impact on not just the way you function, but the way you communicate, for instance. Yes.
Hi, I'm Nagini from Today. I just wanted, was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about how the issues that caregivers face, that you raised with Sally, very particular, or more particular for females. Because it seems like they're very broadly they could apply to anyone across the board.
Right.
But why females in particular? And what are these things that what are the other issues?
So, I mean, as a gender equality organization, we were obviously interested in this issue because of the study that Rahul mentioned, the 2011 study that basically found that most caregivers, most family caregivers were women. So that was our sort of initial sort of starting point as far as interest is concerned. And subsequently, all the studies that have come out actually confirm that it is a gendered issue. So yes, I mean, in terms of the caregiving burden, in terms of having to make certain kinds of work arrangements, although we don't have any specific sort of evidence to this, but intuitively it seems that other caregivers, male caregivers for instance, must experience some similar adjustments, right, as far as work is concerned, as far as caregiving burden is concerned. But because the study is focused only on women, I'm not able to speak to how easy it is to generalize the findings of this study as well as the recommendations to other groups of caregivers, which is why the point that Rahul made about sort of really trying to replicate some of these studies for other caregiving working groups is important. Yeah.
Okay, if we have no other questions, I think we will move on to doing the one-on-one interview. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris and Shelley.
Thank you.
Thank you.